This interview was conducted as research for my coffee table book, Motocross, The Golden Era, and recorded just 2 weeks before Marty Smith and his wife, Nancy, were tragically killed in a dune buggy accident on the glamorous sand dunes. Marty was the nicest and kindest person I've ever interviewed in my many years in the motocross world. His friendly and warm presence is clear for all to see in this, his final interview. In the first episode of this interview, Marty talks about the early years of riding, racing to school on a Yamaha Mini Enduro, getting his first factory contract with an unknown brand, and signing his first big deal with Honda. It's a story of phenomenal talent and boyish good looks. A young kid from San Diego storming to the top of the exploding sport of motocross.
When I was probably 6, my dad got me a little Honda 50 step-through, and I'd ride all day long, out just motoing in the mud hills. I got a 5th overall. 5th overall my first time, lining up with old guys. I was one of the youngest guys out there. All these guys are beards and big fat bellies, and I was a little intimidated, actually. My inspiration was my dad. Yeah, I have to say, my dad was the guy I looked up to. He was a fireman, and I always wanted to grow up and be like my dad. It just wasn't a good year because the bike was so far behind.
How did this whole thing start for you? How did you get into the whole motocross thing?
Well, you know, back in the early, actually late 60s, my dad used to ride with a few of his buddies. He had a handful of guys that had these. They were enduro bikes, and what they would do is they would put some knobby tires on them and take off the street fenders and put some what they would call like scramble parts on there. And they took them out and they made their own tracks and stuff back in the day. And because obviously we didn't have motocross tracks, and they just go out in the hills, and it was a single track trail around bushes, and it eventually, the more guys that rode it and the more that they would ride it, it would get wider and wider and wider. And so they started riding, and you know, us kids would go out with our dads, and we'd want to watch them. We'd hang out, and when I was probably 6, my dad got me a little Honda 50 step-through. I think it was called a Cub. And we started riding those out in Borrego and Ocotillo Wells. And it just evolved from there. It just evolved from there to Yamaha 100, and then it went into a Yamaha AT1. It was a yellow tank, and that was about 1971. And a buddy of mine's, my dad, said, "Hey, you know, Mart's pretty good. You know, they have this place up in Carlsbad. It's called Carlsbad Raceway. And put him on a bike. Put him up there on the line and see how he does, if that's what he wants to do." And so we got a bike ready and put some knobby tires on it, and ended up going up to Carlsbad, and that was my first race back in 1971.
What was the bike, and where did you finish?
It was a 1972 Yamaha 125. Maybe it was a 71. It's a yellow tank, and I got a 5th overall. 5th overall my first time, lining up with old guys. I was one of the youngest guys out there. All these guys are beards and big fat bellies, and I was a little intimidated, actually. A little intimidated.
Were there any names that we'd remember from any of those guys that you can remember?
No, you wouldn't have remembered any of them. You wouldn't know any of them, actually. It was before anybody was anybody.
So, in talking to everybody else, you know, San Diego was kind of the center of the motocross world, it appears, back then, with Brock Glover and you know, Rick Johnson, all these other guys that kind of grew up here. They all quote you as being the inspiration. You were the one that's like, oh yeah, well, you know, Marty was the guy.
That's nice of those guys. That's really nice of those guys.
Every one of them said the same thing. You know, he was the guy we all looked up to. We all tried to emulate him.
It's funny, you know, because now I'm a fan of all those guys too.
Well, that's cool.
Real respect, big respect.
Yeah, but who was your kind of inspiration? Because it seems like you were the first guy, but there must have been somebody that kind of made you go, "Oh, I got to do this." No?
David, my inspiration was my dad. Yeah, I have to say, my dad was the guy I looked up to. He was a fireman, and always wanted to grow up and be like my dad. I had no idea I was going to grow up and be a professional motorcycle racer. Who makes money doing that? And I just was going to follow in my dad's footsteps and be a fireman, and then end up being a professional racer and making a decent living at it.
So was your dad a pretty good rider?
He was. He was. He was real meticulous, and as I said, they were riding on pretty primitive motorcycles. Nothing anywhere close to what we have today. And I think it made us all, him, and as it evolved into me riding, it made us better riders because our equipment was so difficult to. We didn't know no adjustment on the suspension, and it was crazy. It was just crazy what we rode and how we were able to go so fast on it.
So did you work on your bikes with your dad? Or
I did.
You did the wrenching?
I did. My dad did primarily most of the wrenching, but early in the days, my dad would teach me how to adjust the spokes and the chain and clean the air filter and just do basic maintenance on it. And then as I started getting more involved in the racing, we were riding bikes that would fall apart and transmissions would break, so my dad learned how to work on transmissions, learned how to replace the pistons and rings, and he was my mechanic.
So you grew up basically in the middle of San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
You were kind of down. Could you just ride out of your garage and go ride a mini bike somewhere? Or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Where I lived in Point Loma was 2 miles from the beach. And my alley behind my house was all dirt. It was a dirt alley, which you don't see too many of those these days anymore. And I'd get out of school and leave my house and throw a helmet on. I'd have a little Yamaha 60 Mini Enduro, and I'd just start going down the alley. I'd go from side to side, just making berm, berm, berm all the way down and berm, berm, berm all the way back up. I had berms 2 feet high on this little 60 Mini Enduro. And then as we started getting... it started getting a little more popular, and buddies of mine started riding. We had this place called the Collier Trails, and all of us would meet over there after school, and we'd ride for probably till dark. We would handful of us guys would meet over there damn near every day after school, and we had a crowd. People were parked up on the highway watching us, and we had cops that would come by and park in their cars. I mean, it wasn't something like we were getting away with anything and breaking the law. It's just. Back then, it was like kids are out and they're playing in the dirt, and we didn't have computers, and we weren't playing Nintendo and all these crazy things, Mortal Kombat and stuff. So it was way different, and that's what we did pretty much every day during the week.
So you were riding literally
every day.
Because that's one of the things, in asking all the other guys, it's like, well, how did you guys suddenly get so good compared to the guys in Europe or anywhere else basically? And one of the themes seems to be we just rode every damn day because the weather was perfect and we had places we could go ride. I mean, do you think that was for you a contributing factor too?
Yeah, David, it absolutely was. My parents camped. We loved to go camping, and so we would go down to Ocotillo Wells and we'd stay down there for 3 or 4 days, and I'd ride all day long. Out just motoing in the mud hills and in the small dunes, and just I learned every different type of terrain that they could throw at you out there. I learned it, and that was huge. That was a huge part of my success. Was just we didn't have groomed tracks, so we would ride the nastiest, roughest conditions every day during the week, and then all of a sudden you get to a racetrack and it's all groomed and stuff. It's like, holy cow, this is sweet, But we learned on the gnarly stuff, and we learned on it every day during the week, and that was a huge contributing factor of just being able to progress and catch up to the Europeans. But back in the day, there's no way we thought we were going to ever beat the Europeans because that was their sport, and they came from the 60s, and I was coming in from the early 70s, which was one of the very beginning guys. And to think of the Europeans, Joe Robert, and Roger DeCoster and Adolf Wheel and Ben Auberg and all these guys. It's like, man, these guys are motocross gods, you know. Never thought we'd ever compete with them.
But compete with them you did, and pretty damn fast, really.
We did, and a lot of that has to do with the machinery really made big advances in the 70s, you know. I'd say mid-70s, they started making huge strides in the suspension and in the motor and everything else. They made a lot of changes, and for the better, you know.
So you mentioned the name Marty Smith, and everybody instantly thinks of Honda. What happened between '72 at Carlsbad and getting a factory ride for Honda? What was the progression there?
Well, kind of got to take a step back just a little bit. You know, I started riding on that Yamaha, that AT1, and I rode that for about a year, and I turned intermediate on that. And once I got into intermediate, I was riding with some faster guys, and that's when Pentons were really big. So my dad ended up buying me a Penton, a '72 Penton, and again, I was just intermediate right then, and I started doing pretty well on that. Started winning some intermediate races, and then moved to expert on that Penton relatively quick, and I started riding every week. Well, about every other week, Carlsbad Saddleback, and then back in the day, CMC had these series races, and we'd go to Rawhide, we'd go to Escape Country, Trabuco Canyon, and then I got an offer from Monarch Motorcycles, Gary Blandon, which owned a company shop in San Clemente, California. It was Competition Cycles. And he said, hey, he goes, I'd love to sponsor you. And he goes, there's a company called Monarch, and they're interested in you riding for them, and there may be a financial contract for you. Long story short, I ended up signing with those guys for $100 a month. and I thought, it's like, wow, these guys are going to pay me to ride. It's crazy. Yeah, I'll take it. And so they gave me all the bikes I needed, and I started riding that right away at the local races. And then there was a big event coming up at Hangtown in 1973, and it was going to be like what they considered a national. And so Gary Blandon said, let's go up there, we're going to ride that thing. So we loaded up his van and a couple Monarchs, and I was, if not the only Monarch, one of the only few Monarchs. I think I was the only Monarch entered. And I ended up winning. And we ended up driving home that night because I had to go to school the next day. I was still in high school, and
How old were you?
I was, it was 1973. I was probably 15 years old. And we drove home that night. It was late. I got home. I was tired. Woke up the next morning, and I said, Dad, I'm really tired. Can I just hang loose today? He goes, yeah, you can stay home from school today. So, about 9:30 in the morning, my phone rings. And it was somebody that said, hey, this is American Honda Motor Company in Los Angeles, in Gardena, California, and we are putting together a 125 motocross team for next year. AMA is going to have a brand new 125 national class, and are you interested in coming up and talking to us, and maybe putting together a team? And I said, absolutely. So we set an appointment up, and Dad and I went up there and signed a contract with American Honda for 1974 for the 125 class, and that's how it all started.
The rest, as they say, is history,
The rest is history, yeah.
So that was obviously a huge change from Monarch to Honda, although Honda back then wasn't the huge thing that it is today, but still, it was pretty damn big at the time.
Well, yeah, I signed that contract with Honda, and I had no idea what the bike was going to be like. I'd never ridden one. And after we got done, they showed us through the factory and showed us some things up there, and it's like, wow, this bike looks pretty trick, but I'd never ridden it. And wasn't long after that I got one and started riding it and showed up at some local races, and the bike was so far advanced over a Monarch and the Pentons and the Bull Tacos and the CZs. It was amazing. It was like something from outer space. This bike was crazy good.
Now, was that a pure factory bike, or was this something based on a production?
This was completely production. It was absolutely production. Now, this is the bike that I first started riding at local events, and I rode those probably about the last 2 months of 1973. And then when 74 came around, they said, "Hey, we've got a better bike for you. You're going to really like it. It's called a RC, and we're going to call this what we would say a factory motorcycle, and we think you're really going to like it." So we went out and did some testing, and it blew my mind. This Elsinore that I was riding was so amazing, and heads and tails above anything else I'd ever ridden. And all of a sudden, this RC was heads and tails above this Elsinore production bike. It was like, are you kidding me? It was crazy. It was crazy.
So, did you have any input in any of the development along the way with it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, not in the 1974 machine. I had really none. No input on that, because I just signed the contract with them. After I won the championship in '74, they flew me to Japan, and we did lots of testing and development for the '75 production bike and the '75 works bike, factory bike. So that's how, and I flew there again in '76.
So once you get this mind-blowing bike, you can't believe how lucky you are, kind of thing. Well, there must have been stuff during the year, once you got that bike and you started riding, things that you did to kind of make it even better, or did you actually make changes with different suspension things?
No, we did make a lot of changes along the way. Back in my early years with Honda, John R. was my mechanic, and that was Warren Reed's stepdad, and he was an amazing mechanic. Still is to this day, I'm sure. Very meticulous, and Honda of Japan would send over suspension, motors, cylinders, all kinds of different things, and say, "Oh, this is very good on the dyno. It works really good. So let's race with this." Well, John R. was one of these guys that he's very skeptic. He's going to say, "Well, if it's really good on the machine, let's put it out on the track and see if it's just as good on the track." And it was really good that John R. was like that, because some of the stuff that they would send over works really good on the dyno, but not so good on a racetrack. And we would do a lot of testing, and some of the stuff did work, but a lot of the stuff didn't. And so we would make some changes over here to the changes that they sent from Japan.
Yeah, I've heard plenty of stories in researching this book, plenty of stories where people go, "Oh yeah, well, Japan sent us so-and-so and said it was really cool, and the dyno numbers were off the scale and all this kind of thing, but when we did it on the racetrack, well, yeah,
Different story.
All those horsepower numbers don't really mean much." I mean, was that something that kind of went on throughout your career?
Yeah. Absolutely. And it was great. Honda really did get involved in our machines. Unfortunately, the sad part of the big factory, the big company, '74 the bike was amazing. '75 they didn't make any changes on that bike, but the bike was so far advanced over all the other bikes that were out there. It was okay that Honda didn't make a bunch of changes for 1975. So I won the championship again. And then after '75, they made some small changes, but not very many. But Suzuki, Yamaha, they made some huge changes. They made some big changes. Yamaha came out with that OW20 water pumper. And Hanna, obviously Hanna being the intense rider that he was and possessed, and he was getting paid to beat Marty Smith, and their bike was really good. And in '76, Honda made minimal changes, and it caught up to us, and we struggled. It put me in a position where I had to ride that bike even harder, the bike that was basically 2 years old. It was a factory bike, don't get me wrong, it was a good bike, but it wasn't anywhere good as even the Suzuki factory bikes. Nothing close to the Yamaha factory bike. And it forced me into a position where I had to ride harder than I had ridden in the last couple of years. And we had some mechanical failures, and that was the year that I went to Europe and competed in both the GPs and the Nationals. And we rode basically the same bike. I had a European factory bike and I had an American factory bike, but they're basically the same. And we struggled so hard on those things, trying to make them compete. That's when Donnie Emler stepped in and said, "Hey, Marty," he goes, "I could probably make you a pretty good production bike, make you a good race bike out of a production bike." And I was all up for it because we were willing to try anything to be competitive with the Yamaha and the Suzuki and the Kawasaki. And I rode that production bike a few races that Donnie built for me, and it was pretty good. I wouldn't say it was better than the factory bike, but it wasn't breaking. The factory bike we were having some mechanical problems with it, and I DNF'd a few races in Europe in the GPs and still finished third overall, but it just wasn't a good year because the bike was so far behind.
Don't forget to subscribe for more episodes of the Marty Smith Story, and check out my 480-page coffee table book, Motocross: The Golden Era, at motocrossthegoldenera.com.